let's see, we've had train wreck and mashed by a horse and stabbed and head cut off. So I cover it all in my songs. But I've got time for just a few more, and I think maybe I won't do any more death, despair, and destruction songs. I'm going to do one about food instead. Good old standard food that isn't served too much in the Ozarks, but used to be kind of a staple. That is eating possum. Anybody here ever eaten possum? I haven't either, but I've heard all kinds of stories from people who tell me they have. This song has a little recipe in the middle of it, and you might want to write it down in case you want to try it after hearing this song. Well, Jake, he went out a-hunting, 'twas on one moonlit night. He spied a big fat possum just clean up out of sight. Jake, he went to the house and got him an axe, and he began to chop, and he said, look out, little children, there's something gonna drop, drop, drop. Bye-bye, little possum, gonna bile that possum down. Bye-bye, little possum, when the possum hits the ground. Bye-bye, little possum, gonna bile that possum down. We're gonna have a good dinner when the possum hits the ground. See, he went out there to cut it down. You get that by chopping down a tree with an axe because you don't want to shoot a possum. Here's how you want to fix it. Once you catch it, if you want to do this tonight or later this summer sometime, you don't want to go out and shoot them. What you want to get is a good possum hunting dog. And you trail out through the woods until that dog trees a possum. And then you take your axe and you cut down the tree so that you or the dog, one of you, can catch that possum alive. And then you put that possum in a cage for about 3 weeks and feed them scraps from your tables because they've been eating all kinds of awful stinky stuff out there in the woods, and you don't want to eat them right off the bat. But after you've got them fattened up in about 3 weeks' time and you are ready to cook them, this is how you go about it. Now when you get that possum, you cook him good and sweet. You put him in a little frying pan, add sweet taters around his feet. Put in lots of gravy right up to the top. And what we're gonna do, little children, we'll eat till we pop, pop, pop. Bye-bye, little possum, gonna bile that possum down. Bye-bye, little possum, when the possum hits the ground. Bye-bye, little possum, gonna bile that possum down. We're gonna have a good dinner when the possum hits the ground. We'll have a real fine dinner when the possum hits the ground. Here's a song that comes up from Texas and mentions almost all of the rivers of Texas. It's called the Brazos River, which it kind of features, and I've got this one recorded on a tape that I have available. If you're interested in taking any of this music home with you, I've got plenty of tapes with me, and they're $8, and I'd be glad to show them to you. I also have some promotional flyers and some business cards if you'd like to take some information and have me sing for a group you might be involved with. I'd be glad to give you any of that information. Now this has a good sing-along chorus, too, if you feel like singing on it. We crossed the broad Vegas, we boarded the Nueces, swung the Guadalupe and followed the Brazos. Red River runs rusty, the Wichita clear, but down by the Brazos I boarded my dear. Li-li-li-li-li, lend me your hand. Li-li-li-li-li, lend me your hand. Li-li-li-li-li, lend me your hand. There's many a river that waters the land. The fair Angelina runs glossy and gliding. The crooked Colorado runs weaving and winding. And the slow San Antone, it courses the plain. But I never will walk by the Brazos again. Li-li-li-li-li, lend me your hand. Li-li-li-li-li, lend me your hand. Li-li-li-li-li, lend me your hand. There's a many a She kissed me and hugged me and called me her dandy. The Trinity's muddy, the Brazos quicksandy. She hugged me and kissed me and called me her own. But down by the Brazos she left me alone. Lie, lee, lee, pull the boat on. Lie, lee, lee, pull the boat on. Lie, lee, lee, pull the boat on. My Brazos River sweetheart has left me and gone. The girls of Little River, they're plump and they're pretty. The Sabine and Sulphur have many a beauty. On the banks of the Natchez, there's girls by the score, but I never will walk by the Brazos no more. Lie, lee, lee, lend me your hand. Lie, lee, lee, lend me your hand. Lie, lee, lee, lend me your hand. There's a many a river that waters the land. I really appreciate you all coming out today. And I'd be glad to talk to you afterwards. If you want to stay, they've got some drinks here for 50 cents, and y'all might be needing one by now. I know I am. I'm going to close out with a song that just further defines my life a little bit. You'll know me really well after hearing this song. Well, a friend of mine, he got an automobile for $1 down and $1 a week. And every time he turned the wheel, it was $1 down and $1 a week. Bought a credit card for that new machine at $1 down and $1 a week. Filled it full of gasoline for $1 down and $1 a week. Just $1 down and $1 a week. You can get all the things you see for $1 down and $1 a week. Well, he went speeding down the road and kissing his gal up on her cheek. So they took him to jail, but he could have bail. It was $1 down and $1 a week. The judge did fine him $50 and asked if he would like to speak. He said, if I may, I'd like to pay about $1 down and $1 a week. Just $1 down and $1 a week. You can get all the things you seek. $1 down and $1 a week. When he got out, he married that gal at $1 down and $1 a week. They bought a wedding ring, it's pretty cheap, just $1 down and $1 a week. I bought a refrigerator and a washing machine for $1 down and $1 a week. So the food stayed cold and the clothes stayed clean for $1 down, $1 a week. Just $1 down and $1 a week. You can get all the things you see for $1 down and $1 a week. They bought themselves a little home for $1 down and $1 a week. They got a second mortgage and a pretty good loan for $1 down and $1 a week. He said to his wife, it's a pretty good life for $1 down and $1 a week. She said, honey, we don't need much money, just $1 down and $1 a week. Just $1 down and $1 a week. You can get all the things you seek for $1 down and $1 a week. But 6 little kids did soon arrive at $1 down and $1 a piece. He had so many worries that he could not sleep at $1 down and $1 a week. And as his debts began to mount and he added them up upon a sheet, he said, with tears, we'll need 1,000 years at $1 down and $1 a week. Just $1 down and $1 a week. Well, you can't get all the things you seek for $1 down and $1 a week. Thank you all for coming.
Before this young lady runs off, if a few of you linger, I'm going to be telling some stories. And if you will do us a favor, if you can remember Yoacum Ballad.
I thought of that when I saw you, and I don't remember it at all. It's been too long.
Well, in the early 1800s, there came a mountain man who came to Ozarks one day to live off the land. That help you?
No, I've had several people ask me through the years, and it's I've got to relearn that if I do that.
Well, after we have a little break, if some of you linger, I'm going to be telling the story about the early pioneer days, the first white man to come to these hills. And so let's have a break now. I've enjoyed
Get a drink over there.
Music so much. I can remember when I was a lad, a young fellow, we had this kind of music. Unfortunately, too much of our country music's done gone to town. We don't have enough of this. In the pages of history, if you want to get a little closer, why, I'll get a little closer to you. And I'm not sure what direction I'll take. It'll depend on questions that you might ask. If you have a question as I make comments, I'd like to have the show of hands right then, and we'll talk about that subject. I jump around every place anyway. I don't know where I'm going. And so a lady asked me one time, a news reporter, after I'd finished, she said, "I'd like to have a copy of your script." And I didn't know what she was talking about, but actually explained why I knew I didn't have one. So what's going to happen here is going to be determined by you. And as all good storytelling is, laughter is the fertilizer that makes it work. So if I touch upon something that intrigues you, or I just see the smile on your face, that gives me an indication of what direction we may be going. I think I'll share with you the fact that I have old-timer's disease, so I may forget what I said the last second before that if you ask me a question, so you may have to help me get back on track. I'm a native of the Ozark Mountains. I grew up on the first farm above Table Rock Dam. It's now covered. And so it's not easy for me to go back to the old home place since I'm not a diver. But I can visualize in my mind's eye when I'm riding in a boat what it was like when I was a lad. We've gone in my lifetime for that country from a primitive pioneer society, no electric lights, no modern conveniences of any sort, to what we have today. We got so many foreigners down there now that you have to be careful when you go to cross the road. One of them might hit you. Well, I'm going to go way back to some of the early times of, as far back as maybe Judy was singing back even into the Scottish days of Scotland. We're not going to go back near that far. But as she told us, many of the songs get readapted and brought up to today's circumstances. And that's the beauty about oral history or storytelling, is that it lends itself to adapting to a modern situation. Now, almost all Ozark Mountain stories have a little bit of truth in them, some more than others. But almost every story that you hear from storytellers has some fact or some event that instigated the beginning of the story. Then each time the story gets told, why it gets embellished with the memory or with the imagination of the listener. So as we look at my favorite subject, the explanation for why the hill folks said my daddy was screwy in the head, it's the Yoacum Silver Dollar. Judy has sang the song, the Yoacum Silver Dollar, and the first verse I was trying to help inspire her to remember. In the early 1800s, there came a mountain man. He came to Ozark country to live off the land. That man was James Yoacum. He came up the White River in a keel boat about 1800. At this point in history, the Delaware Indians had just been forced to move into this part of the country, and more of them by 1816. The Delaware Indians had became a prominent part of the Indian culture here because they had learned how to adapt to the white man's ways, having been forced west all the way from Delaware to this part of the country. At that point in history, let me set the stage for you. When you crossed the Mississippi River in the 1800s up till 1825 or so, you'd done left civilization. You were in the wilderness, and there was no protection from the law or what society calls the civilized elements. The Delaware Indians were a friendly Indian, as I said, as they'd learned how to live with the white man, and so James Yoacum lived with these Delaware Indians some 10 or 15 years. About 1820, other members of the Yoacum family came here, as had other settlers to the area. The predominant settlers to this area were Scottish. The Yoacums were German and French. The name Yoacum was a German name. These Yoacums had made a silver coin in Bavaria in the early 1700s, a coin that set the stage for the legend of the Yoacum Silver Dollar story that's native to the Ozark Mountains. After the other Yoacums came here and other civilized so-called Caucasians began to come into the area, while there developed a need for a medium of exchange. That is, as Judy was explaining in one of her songs, that so that there wasn't Dutch and Spanish and all different variety of coins, so they had one common medium. Well, this never solved itself. In the early 1800s, there was the Spanish mill silver dollar, there was the Yoacum dollar, and there were other coins that were used, but many times the merchant gave you change with needles and pins and buttons. When you got down below a quarter or down to a bit was 12.5 cents. 2 bits, 4 bits, 6 bits, chopping up a dollar into pieces gives you the change. But when you needed to make smaller change than that, why, the merchants gave buttons and needles and pins as a token to balance it out as near as they could. I'm going to move from that point in history of the Yoacums and the fact that they came here and they made a silver coin. I'm not going to try to explain where the silver came from. There's a variety of opinions as to whether or not the reason Jim Yoacum was the first white man to come to this part of the country, or among the first white men to come to this country, was because he'd wore out his welcome in the East as a result of coming into possession of some silver in an unacceptable manner, and simply pretended to have a silver mine. In any case, the facts of history tell us that there was a Yoacum silver dollar. There are a few coins in existence now. I am not certain whether these are genuine, authentic, original Yoacum dollars, or whether they're a recent version. I have no way of knowing. Some that were found, some 9 or 10, 11 or 12 that were supposedly found in 1980, in the early 1980s, they offered to carbon test in them, Numismatic Society, and they didn't want them to carbon test them. This would have given some indication as to how long they had been made, and so that's what causes me to be concerned about whether or not they are genuine. In the early 1800s up till 1850, this area was not censused to my knowledge. But in the 1850 census in Taney County, my great-great-grandfather, Robert Ayres, was a 27-year-old merchant, had a 23-year-old wife, and 2 children. They had a trading post at what is now close to Forsyth, the Swan Township Trading Post. There was also other trading posts, one being at the mouth of James River, which was called the James Fork Trading Post. these early days, we did not we lived along the rivers and streams. That was the transportation. The roads did not exist yet. The traces, the wilderness trail that became survived from traces of Indians that were designated as white folks first began to come to the area. James Yoacum and the Indians trapped, and they trapped for various things, but beaver was what was prominent. The beaver hat in England was the rage. And so beaver was what they trapped once a year, or sometimes twice a year. James Yoacum went back to Illinois, traded beaver fur for the staples that they needed in this area, and sold some of this to other trading posts, and then sold some himself from near the James Fork Trading Post, not the James Fork Trading Post. But now then, when we jump on up to the 1850 census, the population of Missouri, and particularly this area, had changed from practically no people to several hundred people. This young man that was my great-great-grandfather in 1850 became unpopular in the 1860s as the Civil War was about to break out here. For the most part, the native Ozark Mountain people didn't understand or appreciate what the Civil War was about. We had all the independence we needed. We didn't quite understand what states' rights was. West of the Mississippi, you had about all the rights you could ask for. And there wasn't a large number of slaves, particularly not in the White River Valley, although there were slaves. But the interest, in my opinion, of the position that you took during the Civil War was more related to the circumstances of the moment than they were to any heartfelt, deep, inner feeling. You were forced into a circumstance. And boys on the two different sides of the song Judy sang, two little boys, and one ended up on one side and one on the other, not because those boys had those sentiments, not because their parents did, but because in the course of events, as the northern soldiers came by today and found this young man that was 16, 17 years old and conscripted him on the instant, invited him to become a part of this and maybe encouraged him. And, but his brother, who was about his age, was off hunting today, and so 2 weeks later or a month later the Confederates came along and enticed him to the other side. So then they'd find themselves on opposite sides, not because of any deep sense of understanding of the Civil War situation. In fact, the folks in these Ozark Mountains, if they'd have had a choice, they wouldn't have participated in the war at all. But it was forced upon us. In the upper plateau of Springfield, in this area by this time, while the population was growing faster than it was in the rugged Ozark Mountains, because you could sort of bypass that. One way that folks tried to get away from the Civil War in my part of the country was by just moving deeper into the woods, just abandoning their log cabin here and going on deeper into the woods, and some were successful in that perhaps. But as I was about to tell you, Robert Ayres, his sentiments was in favor of the North. He expressed it pretty strongly, and a good number of the people who traded with him and of the other settlers in the area had Confederate sympathies. And so he soon found that his trade was falling off, and he was invited to leave and moved to Butler, near Kansas City. Then he had those children and other children. These children had children, so his grandchildren said, "Grandpa, tell us a story." Grandpa would tell stories of his days when he was a merchant in the Ozark Mountains, and the streams were full of fish, game was abundant, turkey and deer in the beautiful hills and valleys. My father was one of those grandchildren who was inspired to come to the Ozark Mountains. The train through Branson, Flippin, and that part of the country, flipping Arkansas and on down through there, was completed in the railroad tracks were completed in 1910. So that the old iron horse was now raging through the mountains. And my father came on a railroad train to the Ozark Mountains, and my guess is that he didn't have a ticket and that he was following the mode of a hobo. He came with a French Canadian who couldn't speak English very well, and in 1919 is when he came, about 9 years after the railroad was completed. The city of Reed Springs, which Highway 160 and those folks wanting to get to the lake is a real bottleneck now, is about to be bypassed. And it's going east of town, I think. There's a tunnel that's going to cross just west of the tunnel. That tunnel, it took 2 years to complete it by dynamite and blasting and sleds and mules. Took 2 years to complete that, and that's what brought the town of Reed Springs into existence. Well, this is where my father and the French Canadian got off the train, and my grandfather on my mother's side, my mother's father, had homesteaded this first farm above Table Rock Dam. And this man, Ben Ayres, who was my father, and the French Canadian, lived neighbors to Omer Goodall, who had 10 girls and 2 boys, all healthy. You had big families then, so you had a lot of help picking cotton and tobacco and the work that was necessary around the farm. And somehow or other, this oldest girl, who was my mother, became enamored with this city feller. She saw him as a city feller and had no knowledge of the fact that his roots preceded even her people. But he came here as a result of the fact that his granddaddy used to tell him these stories about how he took a Yoacum Silver Dollar as a medium of exchange and trade in his store. And the story was so intriguing about the possibility that the Yoacums had a silver mine, made that Yoacum Silver Dollar. He came here determined that he was going to find that silver mine if there was one. Just below Silver Dollar City, all around Silver Dollar City, in fact, if you get back in the hills before this latest rush in the last 25 years of tourism and land sales, you could find lots of diggings where people had looked trying to find the Yoacum Silver Dollar. May the 7th, 1923, the Springfield Daily News paper had a story that told about finding 7 Yoacum dollars under the floor of an old log cabin. And that location was right down below Silver Dollar City. You look out the church window down at Silver Dollar City, you can see a little bit of lake. That was where the Neely homestead was. Mr. Neely had hired Ben Ayres, my father, and this French Canadian to replace the rotted boards in the floor of the cabin. Some of these early cabins that were built had sod or dirt floor, but then as folks became a little more sophisticated, they wanted a wood floor. Well, then they built it right on the dirt, and it didn't last long. So possibly Mrs. Neely had stepped through the floor and had demanded that he get this floor fixed. And so my dad and the Frenchman, as they tore out the old floor, put in a new one, they found 7 Yoacum dollars under the floor. My father thought his destiny had been directed to this place. He spent the rest of his life searching and digging in that part of the country, looking for the Yoacum silver mine. Never found it. I found bits of his diary and instances when he found a cave or he found something, and he was sure that he was going to go back the next day and reap the reward for which he came here, but never was successful in that. To the point, 2 cultures existed here at that point in time. The native Ozark mountain hill folk that were living here then, and then those folks who had came when the railroad was built, and then those folks who came following the fact that they could be transported into the hills by the rail. During the time of the railroad, there were railroad men who romanced with the native hill girls, and there were children born from some of these loves, and some of those men were honorable and stayed and made their family and became a part of the Ozark Mountains of southern Stone County. Several of them, however, took leave of the area and were never seen again. So my grandfather, this helps explain my grandfather's position. He begged my mother not to marry this city fella. He don't know how to hunt, he don't know how to fish, he don't know how to farm. What good is he? You'll have a half a dozen young'uns and he'll go off back to the big city and leave you. Well, she was of age. Grandpa was convinced that if his first daughter went bad, all 9 of the rest of them would probably go the same. But he never convinced her, and he never forgave her quite either for marrying against his will. The mountain culture, at this point in history, the man was the head of the house, and he made the decisions. Now, participation and discussion certainly took place, but my grandmother, who lived to be almost 90, tells me stories of, as a 13-year-old girl crossing the plains with a covered wagon train. But the one that I was going to direct your attention to was the story she had told me about when her and Omer, once every 2 months, would go to Branson with their wagon to get a few staples, come back. While they'd go by, and Harold Bell Wright would be herding sheep. Sometimes they'd see him, sometimes they wouldn't. If he needed something, why, he'd wave them down, and they'd pick up something at town for him and bring it back as they came back by. But if she wanted to ask Harold Bell Wright, a preacher, a question, she'd say, "Omer, ask him." This was the culture of the hills. A woman was a hussy who would be so brazen as to direct the question directly to a man herself, unless he was a member of the family. So she'd ask Omer, and then whoever the question was directed to, he would maybe direct it to the woman, but the conversation she hadn't instigated. So she recounted to me, and it was peculiar to me as I asked her, "Why didn't you just ask him?" "Oh, you wouldn't do that. That was not proper." So as a result of my grandfather's opposition to this marriage, May the 7th, 1923 is when you could find the newspaper account of having found all these dollars. May the 23rd, my mother and dad got married. You see, his future was secure. And so this may explain why that my grandfather in particular, but several other folks as well, made this motion to indicate that he and this Frenchman were screwy in the head. The fact that they didn't adapt to the hill culture and do things the way hill folks do was against them. But beyond that, this Frenchman didn't speak good English. So when he and my dad would be walking along the path, carrying a pick and a shovel, and the native hillman come riding on horseback and would greet them, and they'd try to show a kinship or a friendliness toward each other. After some conversation, my dad felt the need to convey to the Frenchman what was being said, or the Frenchman asked, "What did he say?" They'd turn around and talk to each other a little while in French. And this native hillman, a very suspicious character, couldn't figure out what was going on and was suspicious that he's plotting against us or something. Anyway, he'd relate to his other friends. They started talking, and I couldn't understand what they said. That just made them nervous. So this didn't help their acceptance into the hill culture either. My father died when I was 4 years old. I grew up with my grandparents. I grew up in that home, that large family, just as if I was one. See, I was the 13th child. I actually sort of thought part of the time that my grandmother, being suspicious, they may have, some of the kids may have hinted at this or something, that my grandmother, being superstitious of 13, just gave me to her oldest girl, because there was no male father figure for me quite to identify with. I'm not sure how I conceived that notion, but it was probably when I was 11 or 12 years old that it was revealed to me that no, that wasn't the case. My mother taught school right up above Table Rock Dam. She taught at the Notch Community Church right there by Silver Dollar City. She taught at Slane down on DD Highway, rode horseback, back and forth in many instances. The point I was going to make done slipped me. So if I inspired any questions, I think I've rambled so much that it's unlikely. I was going to tell you that my mother teaching school at the flag school on top of the hill there, she taught school the day I was born. She left early and left one of her sisters in charge. And then 2 or 3 or 4 days later, she was back in school again and had me in a little paper box or something. And real learning took place in the classroom, eight classes. And I credit the fact that I'm so smart sometimes the fact that I've been in a schoolhouse almost all my life. But I'm not sure that is, and I'm not sure that very many people really agree with my conclusion. But at any rate, one day I'm told that one of my aunts, who was 7 or 8 at the time, that I was just a baby, some folks had come to visit. It was a rainy day or something, and they had brought their younger kids to school or something. Anyway, they had make some effort to show the teacher that it was all right for her to have her baby in school, in the classroom, teaching and so forth. Why, would make remarks, how cute he is or something probably. And one of them turned to my Aunt Marie one day and said, my, what do you think of this new boy? I remember there was a lot of kids in the family already. And Aunt Marie said, there's a lot of things we needed worse. Well, if she was here today, she might deny that, but that's just the way I remember it, if I can remember back that far. Yes.
Give us what you heard the impressions were of Harold Bell Wright, what kind of person he was. I travel around here, and I go to Pittsburgh, Kansas a lot. That's where he started preaching in a church. They've since restored his homestead over there, and they're going to reprint his early messages here shortly. And I've read a number of his books, but I haven't talked to anybody that had maybe some relative contact with him while he was here in the Ozarks. And of course, a lot of folks have toured the cabin and everything down there, but still don't get any kind of a personal impression of him. Not a lot's written about him.
I might have some ideas, and again, as I said about the stories earlier, some of my imagination may enter in. But at that point in history, the hill folks were suspicious of everybody. The Civil War's impact had not left us yet. The subject I spoke on at the Missouri History Conference 4 or 5 years ago was why we never trust a stranger, the Civil War legacy to the Ozark Mountains. The guerrilla activity that occurred in that area was very brutal. Lots of small skirmishes took place that aren't recorded in history books. And the local native people were the brunt of that abuse. They, soldiers on either side needed a fresh horse. They simply took a horse. they'd butcher the milk cow if they were hungry enough, you know. So this set the stage so we hill folk didn't trust nobody. That that continued, and even though we in our family was against the notion of making alcoholic beverage against the law, why there in those hills, when I was a kid and rode out in the Indian Point area to salt the cattle on the open range, I knew where a couple of moonshine stills were. Now, while we were opposed to it, if some federal from Springfield came down there looking and asking us, we wouldn't tell him nothing. We wouldn't share any information with him. So Harabelle Wright was into this community, into this sort of thing, and he recognized pretty quickly that he was not going to be accepted instantly. But as he had some patience and was recovering from his health situation, and didn't bother anybody, didn't intimidate anybody, and the Ross family had employed him, and the Ross family had a high level of acceptance in the community. So Harabelle Wright earned that by virtue of his own patience and his intimacy with the Ross family. So as they learned, he was a source of what's happening in the outside world. Many people, I was 9 or 10 years old before I came to Springfield. Many up till the 1920s, many women, not many, but a few of the women, their husbands would come to Springfield, but they didn't come that often. They'd stay back home. But Harabelle Wright was soon a part of the community and gained acceptance here. Any other questions come to mind?
Like float the river, there's one about the White River was like before they put that dam in now.
Floating the river?
For commerce.
Yeah. Well, I digress again, and you wonder if I'm ever going to get to respond to your question. The railroad came through, as I said, in 1910, but it provided then a means of getting the railroad ties. You see, from here west, there wasn't any oak trees to make the railroad ties with. And so many of the odd sections in that part of the country were given to the railroad or sold to the railroad as a means of inducing those ribbons of steel to go across the plains so that old iron horse could race all the way to the west coast. So the industry that came to this area, the first industry after the railroad was here, was tie hacking, cutting ties. Most of these trees here are too big to make a good tie. Some of those across the street over there, about 14, anywhere from 12 to 16 inches diameter were about right. And so tie hacking was one of the early industries, and you could either snake them with a team of mules or horses to the river bluff, slide them off into the river and float them to Branson, or you could load them on wagons, carry them up to Reed Springs or over on Roark. But to get more directly to your question, the White River served, going back a little farther than that, the steamboat used to come to Forsyth. In the wintertime, if the river was right, it had come as far as the mouth of James River. But that happened only once every 5 or 6 years. But the White River served as a mode of transportation of the railroad ties. Now, the four of us would gather together and cut ties, and we'd put different marks on the ties to indicate our ties. So when we got them down there, we knew about how many we had. The easy way, of course, was once you slide them off of the bluff, and near my home was a tie slide. And I learned early what that industry was. It was gone by then, for the most part. But two of us would go on to Branson, and then two of us would float with the tides. We'd just make us a raft together, and we might jug fish on the way, a version of jug fishing, but we'd fish enough with just a pole to catch a few fish, and then we'd raft to the bank and let the tides go right on floating. Our job was to keep them out of the sloughs. They'd float back in there and eddy themselves up in there and hide, and so you got in there and got those out, or you'd lose them. I remember you from someplace, and I got a little publicity on TV back 2 or 3 months ago when the town of Lakeview decided to change its name to Branson West. So I got my name and my face on TV. I really got caught up, got a little more of that than I wanted. But if you're going through Lakeview or Branson West now, on the right side is the Phillips 66 station, Jig's Quick Stop. I was wondering whether everybody was hearing me good, and I guess you can. I was in a little bigger audience than this about a year ago, and some folks were having a little trouble hearing me, and they were cupping their ears, and pretty soon I got the notion of what they were saying. But as folks like us communicate with each other, misunderstanding what we say sometimes is disappointing, to say the least. I wanted to tell you a little incident that happened a few months ago there at Jig's. I'd pulled in my pickup truck to get some gas, and Jiggs came out to talk to me, and while we were talking there and running the gas in, some folks drove up in a real pretty car, a man and a woman. I assumed at the time it is his wife, but I don't know whether it is his wife or somebody else's wife. But you see, you assume things sometimes and get them out of context, so then you tell it wrong. Well, this fellow pumped his gas. While his gas was running in, he got some of that windshield cleaner, cleaned up the windows. And the thing I noticed about it was that he wasn't satisfied just to wipe the windows. He started cleaning the bumper, and he cleaned the mirror, and he said something to the woman that was with him about something. I didn't hear what she said. When you get about my age, well, you don't hear quite as good as you may have heard before. And Mr. Jiggs, he's as old as I am, so we're both in the same boat. After this, he handed her a wet towel, and she wiped the dash, and then pretty soon she opened the door and got out and picked up that little carpet out of the deal there and shook it daintily. And I thought she was dressed too well to be doing that kind of stuff, and wondered why they hadn't cleaned the car up before they left. Just caught my attention as a result of that. And haven't seen her do all this. Well, Mr. Jiggs decided to go back in the store, and my gas tank was about full by now, and I was finishing. And she turned to him and she said, "Do you have restrooms?" And that's what I thought she said. Mr. Jiggs thought she said, well, I'm not sure what he thought. But anyway, when she said, "Do you have restrooms?" Mr. Jiggs told me later that he thought she said wishbone. Restroom, wishbone. And so he said, "No, honey, I haven't, but I got a brand new nozzle for my air hose over here." And they got in that car, and I think he lost that customer. So if you're down there and want to get gas, why, stop in and try to make up for that customer. Did anybody else have any questions? I don't want to bore you all to death. You've been a nice audience. Any aside to anything, comments I've made? Yes.
What source do you rely on for saying that the Yoacum came here about 1800?
Karsh, in his book Missouri History, says that he came here as early as 1790. Now, the problem I have with that, and this was the most frustrating thing to me, the reason I got into this and I've authored a book, Traces of Silver, and I didn't have any notion that I could write anything. The fact is, one of my neighbor Hill friends, when my book came out and somebody told him I'd written a book, he said, hell, I don't know how he could write a book. He gave me a check the other day and he couldn't hardly write his name. So he allowed as hell that my wife, this pretty woman right over here, possibly wrote the book, you know, and I was just getting the credit for it. But one of the most frustrating things to me when I started doing research in this, and I might add that the thing that set the stage for me to decide to redeem my name was the fact that there was rumors in the Hill that Ben Ayres was kind of screwy in the head. And so I wanted to determine something about why he seemed to be obsessed with this Yoacum Silver Dollar story. And when you read history, and I wrote a lot of letters to Columbia, and they were so kind to help me a lot, sending back information. The very most frustrating thing of all was you'd read one thing, one book, and it'd say one thing and another one, and they couldn't both be right. One or the other of them had to be wrong. So if James Yoacum came here as early as 1800 and took an Indian bride named Winona, then how come some other books that seem to be pretty credible in their source as well credit the Delawares with not getting here until 1810? So what was happening in those 10 years there? There were 5 tribes of Delawares and related tribes, Pinkishaws and Louise, that were with the Delawares when they came here. The government paid these Delawares, some living in Ohio, some in up near what is now Winona, Missouri, to all come here and live in the James River Valley. They got about $3,000, a little over $3,000 in silver coins. And some say that the Yoacums simply melted down those coins that they got from the Indians because they were selling the Indians beverage alcohol, which was against the law. And John Pope Camel was the Indian agent. And there's another John Pope Camel that's alive today. I saw him on TV the other day. But John Pope Camel, which Camel Street was named after, was the Indian agent. And in one of his reports, he tells of chasing Solomon Yoacum off of the Delaware land because he was selling them beverage alcohol. So some say that this was a method of laundering this money by melting it down and recasting it. Elmo Engenthorn, who wrote Land of Taney, his theory was that these bits that got chopped up to make smaller change, when you chopped up a Spanish mill dollar or any other dollar-sized coin, recast them, that the Yoacum simply put their brand on them to lend some credibility to the fact that this was getting it back in circulation again after you get too many bits, I guess. So you just have to pick a date knowing that there's not anybody that's going to be able to refute it except by the same method that you used. And that's the reason why that I'm identified sometimes as a folklorist, whereas the professors in the colleges, they'll call them historians. When I went, right after my book came out, Dr. Bob Flanders invited me to speak to his Ozark Studies class, and came in and did, enjoyed it very much. I was somebody then, you know, it wasn't just a...
What's the name of your book again?
Traces of Silver. Well, Flanders and Dr. What's the other one? Bob. What? Gilmore. Were both present in this, and they were going to go to the history conference sometime after that. And one of them said to the other one, said, "Why don't we take Artie Ayres with us to the history conference?" Sort of like if you'd gone to Africa and found a white monkey and you could bring it back and show it off. They'd take him up there and show him off. And the other one responded, "Well, didn't you know that Artie's got a degree from the University of Missouri?" "Yeah," he said, "but no one will ever suspect it." So that's what got me up there a few years later. Anybody else have a comment, a question?
Yeah, we're Minnesotans until 10 years ago, and we've subscribed to the Ozark Mountaineer. And I read, I believe it's there that I read this theory, you know, that they were in the early days, in the 1820s or so, before legal pioneers were allowed here, that they were rum runners to the Indians, and this idea of producing coins out of the U.S. legal tender to save themselves from being punished, and concocting a story. But they also, the thing that really stuck with me was that these rum runners and counterfeiters, their children were the #1 citizens of these local counties, the bankers and the merchants, and if there was any high society, they were it. That really kind of struck me, you know, speaking of descending from nobility, typical Southern nobility in my mind.
Well, you know, there's certain remarks folks make that you're better not to respond to. But I'll play the part of the fool. Go ahead. Solomon Yoacum in the 1850 census was listed as one of the richest men in this part of the country.
Sure.
Riches measured by the number of animals and other things that he had. Somehow or other, a new Cadillac gives you prestige that an old broken down car doesn't give. You're a little more honorable somehow. Society has a way of doing that to you. And I heard a description the other day that I thought explained mixed emotions better than anything I'd heard for a long time. And all the progress that we got going on in our part of the country, and I had mixed emotions about the name Branson West and Lakeview and so forth. And we had some old timers that were pretty much against the notion. We don't want to be like Branson. Well, they were thinking of the modern day Branson. But a fellow said, you know, my best description of mixed emotions is to see my mother-in-law drive my brand new Cadillac off of White Rock Bluff into Table Rock Lake. And so sometimes stories get embellished beyond what they should be simply because they're amusing. But I think you're correct in that what is acceptable in some circumstances is not acceptable in others. And I'll lose my credibility if I don't shut up on that. Has anybody else got another question? These Minnesotans, and the way they say this, you know, is always. I lived out of the Ozarks 1 year, except for while Uncle Sam. That's when I was in the paratroopers in World War II, and I got in some circumstances I didn't think I'd ever make it back. That's when I promised myself I was going to research and find out who I was. And one year we lived in Mount Morris, Illinois, near Rockford and west of Chicago, and we went up into your part of the country. I got up to Minneapolis one time, and I never did pronounce it that way. That wasn't the way we were taught to say it, Minnesotans. And now, if anybody else here will say that word, they won't say it the same way he does, will they? Will they? Maybe. Well, thanks for your kind attention. I appreciate it. And no test. You asked me the question. Thanks a lot for your
I was standing by my window yesterday morning, without a thought of sorrow or of care, when I saw the postman coming up the pathway with such a happy look and jolly air. He rang the bell and whistled while he waited, and then he said, "Good morning to you, Jack." But little knew the sorrow that he brought me when he handed me that letter edged in black. With trembling hands I took the letter from him. I opened it and this is what it said. "Come home, my boy, your dear old daddy needs you. Come home, my boy, your dear old mother's dead." The last words that your mother ever uttered were, "Tell my boy I want him to come back." My eyes are blurred, my poor old heart is breaking, as I'm writing you this letter edged in black. Those angry words I wish I'd never spoken. You know I didn't mean them, don't you, Jack? May the angels bear me witness, I am asking your forgiveness in this letter edged in black. In 1903, there was a train on the Southern Line, hello, headed from Washington, D.C. down to Atlanta, Georgia. But as it was going up a real steep, tall mountain in Danville, Virginia, it fell over the side all the way down to the bottom, and it demolished the train and killed everybody on it. Hope you enjoy it. Let's see how it begins. Well, they gave his orders in Monroe, Virginia, saying, "Steve, way behind time. This is not 38, she is old 97. You must put her in dispenser on time." So he turned and said to his tired, greasy fireman, "Shovel on a little more coal. And when we reach that white old mountain, you can watch old 97 roll." Well, it's a mighty rough road from Lynchburg to Danville on a line on a 3-mile grade. It was on that grade that he lost his average. You can see what a jump he made. He was going down that grade, making 90 miles an hour, when his whistle broke into a scream. They found him in the wreck with his hands on the gravel. He was scalded to death by the steam. Now, I think that pretty well completes the story right there, but I feel that a fellow probably wrote this song because they didn't stop right intended as a warning of some kind. Now all you ladies, you'd better take warning from this time now and learn. Never speak harsh words to your true love and husband, he may leave you and never return. Back in the 17th century, there was, in Scotland, there was three brothers who were a cattle rustling ring. They completed the ring themselves, and they were evidently real good at it. But one time, one of the fellows got caught, and he got thrown in jail. Archie was his name. They were from Caulfield. Well, his two brothers, Dickie and Jockey, decided that they were not going to let their brother rot in jail, so Jockey, who evidently was a man of just Homeric strength, he was huge according to what I've read, simply broke into the prison and broke down the locks and broke the chains and carried his brother out, even though he had a lot of weight around him, supposed to keep him from escaping. Well, they got on their horses and they traveled across a river that their pursuers could not follow, and they got away. And somebody wrote a song about that called Artie Ayres. But along about 1737, the colonists of Massachusetts were having a problem, and they drew on this same song, but adapted it to their stories. The problem was that all the colonies had money based on Spanish coinage, but all of the money in the different areas was worth different amounts, and it was really hard to do trading. So Parliament saw this problem and decided what they needed to do was to create new money, which they called tenor, and distribute it throughout the colony so everybody was using the same kind of money. But there was a lot of disagreement. The colonies did not want to give up their own standard of money, and one in particular, John Webb, he was the mint master at Salem, Massachusetts, decided he was going to keep producing the old tenor, which he did. And he promptly got thrown in jail as well. And when his friends busted him out of jail, somebody remembered this song and adapted it just a little bit, put John Webb's name in there, and changed Artie Ayres to one that's now called Billy Broke Locks. Good sing-along chorus if you feel like singing today. So the frat house at the Bentley House can get louder than they can sometimes. There was 9 to hold the British ranks and 5 to guard the town about, 2 to stand at either hand and 1 to let the old tenor round. And Billy broke locks and Billy broke bolts and Billy broke all that he came nigh, till he came to the dungeon door that he broke right manfully. There was 80 weight of good Spanish iron between his neck bone and his knee. But Billy took Johnny up under his arm and lugged him away right manfully. And Billy broke locks and Billy broke bolts and Billy broke all that he came nigh, till he came to the dungeon door that he broke right manfully. Then they mounted their horses and away they did ride, and oh, but they rode manfully, till they came to the river bank, and there they alighted right manfully. And Billy broke locks and Billy broke bolts and Billy broke all that he came nigh, till he came to the dungeon door that he broke right manfully. And then they called for a room to dance, and oh, but they danced merrily, and the very best dancer among them all was old John Webb, who was just set free. And Billy broke locks and Billy broke bolts and Billy broke all that slightly different version than I do it, but the verse about a dog looking so sad because he's afraid he's about to be eaten was the one that tickled him most, and it was pretty much the same in his version and mine both. Did you ever hear tell of sweet Betsy from Pike? She crossed the wide mountains with her darling Ike, with 2 yoke of oxen and 1 spotted hog, tall Shanghai rooster and an old yellow dog, singing to Raleigh, to Raleigh, to Raleigh, yay, singing to Raleigh, to Raleigh, to Raleigh, yay. They soon crossed the desert where Betsy gave out, and down in the sand she lay rolling about, while Ike in great tears looked on in surprise, saying, Betsy, get up, you'll get sand in your eyes, singing to Raleigh, to Raleigh, to Raleigh, hey, singing to Raleigh, to Raleigh, to Raleigh, hey. Well, the Shanghai ran off and the cattle all died. The last piece of bacon that morning was fried, for I got discouraged and Betsy got mad, while the dog wagged his tail looking wonderfully sad, singing to Raleigh, to Raleigh, to Raleigh, yay, singing to Raleigh, to Raleigh, to Raleigh, yay. Oh, like and sweet Betsy attended a dance where I wore a pair of his Pike County pants, and Betsy got dressed up in ribbons and rings, said, Ike, you're an angel, but where are your wings? Singing to Raleigh, to Raleigh, to Raleigh, yay, singing to Raleigh, to Raleigh, to Raleigh, yay. A miner said, Betsy, will you dance with me? I will you a lass if you don't make me free, but don't dance me hard, do you wanna know why? Doggone me, I'm chock full of strong alkali, singing to Raleigh, to Raleigh, to Raleigh, yay, singing to Raleigh, to Raleigh, to Raleigh, yay. Well, Ike and sweet Betsy got married, of course, but I, being jealous, obtained a divorce, and Betsy, well satisfied, said with a shout, goodbye, you big Lamarcks, I'm glad you backed out, singing to Raleigh, to Raleigh, to Raleigh, yay, singing to Raleigh, to Raleigh, to Raleigh, yay. I teach school out at Willard. Not for 3 months. That's why you see this big smile on my face right now. But occasionally I sing for the kids out there at the school, and regardless of what it is I sing for them, the one they like the best is this one right here. A rather dramatic song from the 1600s about a young fellow who goes to his mother and says, Mom, I'm thinking about getting married, but I can't decide which girl. So on the one hand, there's fair Eleanor, and I really love her. Well, she's beautiful, and she's awful nice, and she's got everything I like in a girl, Mom, but she doesn't have any money. So if I was to marry her, why, we'd be real poor. And he said, on the other hand, there's the one they call the brown girl, and I really don't like her at all. She's not very nice, and she's not very pretty, but she's got a lot of money. And she's made it known that she'd marry me if I'd have her. And I was wondering what you thought about it. Well, his mother thought on the matter a minute, and this is the answer she gave him back. The brown girl, she has house and land. Fair Eleanor, she has none. The best advice I can give to you is to bring the brown girl home. Well, I must go tell fair Eleanor and ask her to my Lord Thomas for me. But she dressed herself all out in red, and around her neck in green, and every station that they rode through, they took her to be some queen. Now here they are at the scene of the wedding, and he makes a very fatal mistake. For he'd taken fair Eleanor by the hand and led her through the hall. He sat her in a golden chair, so high above them all. The brown girl, she had a little headlight. It looked so wondrous sharp between the short ribs and the long. She stuck fair Eleanor's heart. Taking the brown girl by the hand, he led her through the hall. He'd taken that knife and he cut off her head and threw it against the wall. Placing the handle against the wall, the blade at his chest, he said, "Here goes three true lovers. God send us where we'll rest. Go dig my grave on yonder hill, dig it wide and deep, and bury fair Eleanor in my arms, and the brown girl at my Oh, bang 'em, will you hunt and ride? Dill 'em down, dill 'em. Oh, bang 'em, will you hunt and ride? Dill 'em down. Oh, bang 'em, will you hunt and ride? A sword and pistol by your side. Look-ee-look-eye, wheel-a-quack-whoa. There is a wild boar in these woods. Dill 'em down, dill 'em. There is a wild boar in these woods. Dill 'em down. There is a wild boar in these woods. He eats men's bones and drinks their blood. Look-ee-look-eye, wheel-a-quack-whoa. Oh, bang 'em drew his wooden knife. Dill 'em down, dill 'em. Oh, bang 'em drew his wooden knife. Dill 'em down. Oh, bang 'em drew his wooden knife. He swore he'd take the old boar's life. Look-ee-look-eye, wheel-a-quack-whoa. Oh, bang 'em rode to the wild boar's den. Dill 'em down, dill 'em. Oh, bang 'em rode to the wild boar's den. Dill 'em down. Oh, bang 'em rode to the wild boar's den. He found the bones of 1,000 men. Look-ee-look-eye, wheel-a-quack-whoa. They fought 4 hours in the day. Dill 'em down, dill 'em. They fought 4 hours in the day. Dill 'em down. They fought 4 hours in the day. They all tore up and run away. Look-ee-look-eye, wheel-a-quack-whoa. Oh, bang 'em, did you win or lose? Dill 'em down, dill 'em. Oh, bang 'em, did you win or lose? Dill 'em down. Oh, bang 'em, did you win or lose? He swore by gum he won his shoes. Look-ee-look-eye, wheel-a-quack-whoa. 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 I first got interested in traditional music back when I was in elementary school, and I went to the Laura Ingalls Wilder Museum and saw a little bit of those books come to life there. And I found a little orange songbook that had some songs in it that told these wonderful stories, and I immediately got hooked on the stories. Well, Laura Ingalls mentioned in her very first book, Little House on the Prairie, I think is the first one, that when
a covered wagon. She would sleep inside the covered wagon or underneath it sometimes, and her pa would play the fiddle. And she mentioned some of the songs that she remembered him playing, and this is one of the songs that he played. It's called the Tombigbee River. On the Tombigbee River, so bright I was born, in a hut made of husks, in the tall yellow corn. It was there I first met with my Judy, so true, and I rode her about in my gum tree canoe, singing row away, row o'er the water so blue, like a feather wind floating out a gum tree canoe. All day in the field, soft cotton I hoe. I think of my Julia, dream as I go. I catch her a bird with a wing of true, and at night sail around in my gum tree canoe, singing row away, row o'er the water so blue, like a feather wheel floating out a gum tree canoe. One night the stream bore us so far away that we couldn't go back, so we thought we'd just stay. Then we spied a tall ship with a flag of truce, and it took us in tow in our gum tree canoe, singing row away, row o'er the water so blue, like a feather wheel floating out a gum tree canoe, singing row away, row in the water so blue, like a feather wheel floating out a gum tree canoe. Here's one of my favorites. I think it's a very well-written song, and I don't really know anything at all about it. About a young lady pining for the fellow she never got to have. It's called the Palace Grand, or sometimes called Lady Mary. Came from his palace grand, he came to my cottage door. His words were few, but his looks, they will linger forevermore. The look in his sad dark eyes, more tender than words might be, but I was nothing to him, though he was the world to me. There in his garden so fine, all dressed in white satin and lace, Lady Mary so proud and so cold, I've always liked horses. So I was early on drawn to cowboy songs. And they're all very tragic songs, so this one's no exception. This guy dies in a most horrible way. But he enjoys the cowboy way of life for just a little bit. This is called Little Joe the Wrangler. He was Little Joe the Wrangler, he'll wrangle nevermore. His days with the Bermuda, they are o'er. It was a year ago, last April, that he rode into our camp. Just a little Texas stray and all alone. His saddle was a Texas camp made 20 years ago, and an okay spur on the foot lightly slung. His bedroll in a cotton sack was loosely tied behind, and his canteen o'er the saddle horn was hung. He said if we would give him work, he'd do the best he could, though he didn't know straight up about a cow. So the bossy cut him out a mount and kindly put him on, 'cause he sorta like this little kid somehow. He learned to wrangle horses and know 'em all by name, and to get them in by daybreak if he could. To follow the chuck wagon and to always hitch the team, and to help the consignette old Russell Wood. We had driven down to Pecos, the weather being fine, and camped on the south side in a bend, when a norther started blowing and we called out every man, for he'd taken all us hands to hold 'em in. Little Joe the Wrangler was called out with the rest, although the kid had scarcely reached the hood, when the cattle they stampeded like a hailstorm long they fled. We was all a-riding for the lead. Midst the streaks of lightning, a rider we could see. It was Little Joe the Wrangler in the lead. He was riding old Blue Rocket with a slicker o'er his head, trying to check the cattle in their speed. At last we got them kneeling and kind of quieted down, and the extra guard back to the wagon went. But there was one on missing, and we knew it at a glance. Was our little Texas stray, poor Wrangler Joe. Next morning, just at daybreak, we found where Rocket fell in a washout 20 feet below. And beneath his horse, mashed to a pulp, his spurs had rung the knell. 'Twas our little Texas stray, poor